Welcome to the Lexington Public Library's Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast, where we discuss everything Lexington and Fayette County history. I'm Mariam, and in each episode of this podcast, we will feature a guest that will share a piece of local history. So thank you for tuning in and enjoy. Good day, everyone. Today we have Peter Brackney. Peter Brackney is a Lexington-based attorney, primarily practicing in estate planning, probate, and bankruptcy. He's also a preservationist and the creator of the blog The Kaintuckeean that covers a wide range of Lexington and Kentucky history. In 2014, Peter Brackney released his book Lost Lexington, which highlights several of Lexington's treasures that have either been forever lost or since forgotten. Treasures like the Phoenix Hotel, Green Hills Mansion, the Centerpoint Block, Town Branch, and many more. Welcome, Mr. Brackney.
Thanks, Mariam.
Thank you so much for joining us. Your book, Lost Lexington, is divided up into different chapters by the different sites that you researched and think we need to remember. One of those is, of course, Town Branch. William McConnell, of course, settled with his frontiersmen, a group of frontiersmen, and the story of Lexington begins.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about that body of water.
Sure. So, of course, McConnell Springs is where William McConnell and his original party back in the late 1770s first came up with the name Lexington. It was in 1775, the Battle of Lexington up in Massachusetts, part of the Revolutionary War. They were here shortly after that for that initial visit, and then came back a few years later and started the establishment of Lexington on the banks of the Town Branch. So really integral part of Lexington's history.
Yeah.
Lexington's plat, the city itself, is oriented around the Town Branch. If you think a lot of cities, their roads are east and west, north and south. And while we've got a north and a south Broadway, it's not cardinal. It's not north and south. Truly, it's askew, and that's because of how Town Branch runs through the downtown.
Yes.
So Lexington really owes itself to the Town Branch.
That's how it started.
Yeah.
In the chapter of Town Branch, you, of course, mentioned the 2 cholera outbreaks. How did cholera outbreaks affect how Town Branch was used in Lexington?
So there's one quote I found that referred to the Town Branch as a miserable canal. And it was offensive smell, filth, everything just kind of went through the waters. It was where trash would have been dropped. Any number of things would have ended up in the Town Branch. And so in the 1800s, we didn't necessarily know how disease was spread, and it surprised the medical community at Transylvania a lot to learn why was this disease spreading.
Yeah.
And so the 1833 cholera outbreak was the first, and the second major was in 1849.
Yeah.
And the Town Branch was, of course, the cause of that because of the waste that was carried through. And I know you've got another episode of the podcast where Terry Foodie has.
Exactly.
Hopefully there'll be a link to that in the notes.
Of course. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, people can listen to that for the details about the both cholera outbreak.
But it was a lot of difference between the 33 and the 49 outbreak because they started to realize the connection between what was in the water and what diseases were being carried in the water.
Because originally people thought it was just an airborne illness, but it's actually a waterborne.
It is waterborne.
Yeah.
And so the city of Lexington passed a couple of ordinances in between the 2 outbreaks. One required certain restrictions on how privies, outhouses were to be constructed. And then there was also a prohibition on pigs roaming free in the streets. So there were a couple of changes that they realized, hey, these things may not be good ideas.
Yes, yeah. Something that was a benefit and a resource for the city turned into a detriment, basically.
Turned into a detriment. And so it also became a source of flooding and other issues in the early 1900s. And that's really what caused, during the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s, them to finally completely cover over the Town Branch. The smaller coverings had been built earlier, but it was finally covered over during the WPA.
Yeah.
And so it used to have Water Street, which we still have a small Water Street. Water Street used to run parallel to Vine Street, and Vine Street used to be a much narrower road. So as they cut through with Town Branch and covered it over, it allowed for that widening of Vine Street that we
Yeah.
know today.
And of course, most Lexingtonians are familiar with the new plans for Town Branch and kind of a revival of the idea of Town Branch. What are your thoughts on the new project?
I think it's a wonderful project. I think of course, it's not a lot. There's a misconception that it's going to bring the entire Town Branch back to the surface,
No,
and that's
of course
not going to
not.
happen. But I think it's going to be a great asset to downtown. I think that anything that improves pedestrian and walkability and bicycle access will be positive, and I think it'll be a great resource, especially with the park to the west of the convention center. I think it's just be a great asset for the community.
It'll definitely benefit the library, I think, with people being able to walk
Yes.
up to. So it'll be nice. It'll be nice. Speaking of the library, another section in your book is about Phoenix Hotel. And that's where the site of Central Library is at currently. But tell us about that corner on Main Street.
So, if I can, let me take a step back even before that corner on Main Street and talk about the library for just a minute, because I think it's important to remember really where the preservation movement and kind of Lost Lexington really began. And the first chapter of my book is about the Bradford House, which sits catty corner to the library's old location, which is now the Carnegie Center in Grotz Park. And so that building was the Hart Bradford House at the corner of Mill and 2nd Streets, was demolished in the mid-1950s and really started as a launch point for the preservation movement in central Kentucky. And so, of course, years passed and that movement kind of got re-energized again with what took place at the Centerpoint block, and I know we'll touch on that here in a few minutes. But catty corner from the Hart Bradford House, where the library was, and so where the library is now, the Central Branch, that was the old Phoenix Hotel.
Yeah. Which was a very important part in Lexington history.
It was. And that location, by succession, was the oldest hostelry in Lexington. It started off as Postlethwaite's Tavern back in the 1790s. So a long, long history of that building, multiple buildings. It was burned down a few times over the course of its almost 2-century history. And one of those fires was in 1820. And the Lexington Public Advertiser, one of the local newspapers at the time, had a wonderful kind of description of what took place and a charge to the owners of the property of what to do next. And of course, I discovered these through the resources of the Kentucky Room. So I'll read just a little bit from that Advertiser article. Fire, fire, fire. This town was again alarmed by this dreadful cry. In the course of a few hours, a hotel distinguished for the comforts for which it afforded to the way-worn traveler is in ashes. We hope, however, it may soon rise like the phoenix from its ashes. And it was through that newspaper article that they came up with that name, the Phoenix Hotel, before that had been known by whoever owned the hostelry. And so when it reopened a year or two later, that's when it became the Phoenix Hotel.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And the year before the fire was interesting. That was the year 1820, when President Monroe was on his grand tour of the South. And so Monroe, Jackson, and I believe Zachary Taylor all would have stayed at what became Phoenix Hotel on that property during that tour in 1820. So you had 3 presidents under roof.
Wow.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how it was demolished?
That second fire led towards the construction in 1914 of the final Phoenix Hotel. It was interesting. That was about 2 years after the Titanic sunk, which was the unsinkable ship.
Oh, yeah.
And so it was advertised that the Phoenix Hotel was the fireproof hotel. So concerning, given the history that the hotel had.
It's like from now on, never label anything that's fire-free or unsinkable. Don't name anything like that.
There's risks associated, But it was not fire that ultimately took down the Phoenix Hotel. In the early 1980s, Wallace Wilkinson, who became governor, was prepared to, as a developer of the World Coal Center. And so it was to be a skyscraper in Lexington where coal companies could have their headquarters, and law firms were planned to relocate into that building. And it was going to be quite the big building in downtown.
Lofty dreams.
Lofty dreams. And it was demolished. The Phoenix Hotel was demolished and lost at that point. And of course, as you mentioned earlier, the Central Library is located on that, and also is Phoenix Park,
Yes.
which is named after the old hotel. Yeah. And that is a temporary park. It's been a temporary park since the 1980s. Over half of Americans were not born yet, I think, by the time that when that park was begun. Yeah. And it was a temporary park.
I did not realize it was supposed to be a temporary park. I thought it was just, add another park to the...
Right. The idea was to make that property, which was just debris filled, a little more presentable for the 1984 Final Four, which was held at Rupp Arena. Yes. So it was all a little bit of a beautification. We may remember a grassing over of a certain block right across Limestone that kind of has that same thing going on. Yeah. History has a funny way of repeating itself.
It does, yeah. Of course, it eventually didn't follow through. Those plans went by the wayside.
Right. That development did not occur, and so that's ultimately why we have the properties that we have now with the library and the park.
Yeah, and the library, of course, opened in 1989. We just celebrated 30 years, actually.
Wow.
Speaking of the property across the street, Center Point block. So this is probably what most Lexingtonians are familiar with. And the city center is just opening. Take us back to that block. What buildings stood there? What's the history of that 4-point block?
Sure. When it was demolished in its final state, we had already seen some of the buildings were lost to history. Of course, I had already talked about along Vine Street, there used to be Water Street. So where we used to have Farmers Market before the Fifth Third Pavilion was built, some of the listeners may remember Farmers Market being along Vine Street.
I remember there, I remember we used to park nearby there and go to the Farmers Market when I was little,
And so that was, of course, again, much narrower than it was. Across the street would have at one point been Jackson Hall, which was the old city market. And so some of the buildings that were on the south side of the Center Point block have been long demolished, and other ones had been demolished along the way. But there were still some outstanding anchors to that block when it was demolished. Some of the most significant were along Upper Street, and those were called Morton's Row. Morton's store was effectively at the corner of Upper and Vine. And that was described as one of the oldest, most handsome, and on the exterior most intact of downtown Lexington's commercial buildings. Because you see the structures on that block were some of the oldest commercial buildings in Lexington, dating as far back as 1780. So that's really where the commercial hub of Lexington began. And, and commerce continues today.
Of course.
But that building, that handsome Morton store, for listeners, that was the one that had Joe Rosenberg's at the corner with the pediment window and the half moon window under the pediment. It was a well constructed, attractive building, about 2.5 stories, and it was part of a long row that went across Upper Street. Morton's Row, Morton's store, was named after William Morton, who was one of Lexington's earliest and wealthiest philanthropic merchants. In his will, he left a significant amount of funds for education in Lexington. And of course, Morton Middle School is named for him, which used to be located at Walnut and Short Street, which is now Martin Luther King and Short Street. The other building that I always think is on the opposite corner. And that was where Joe Rosenberg's was before it went to the Morton store.
Oh, okay.
And that was at the corner opposite, well, it's actually where the Starbucks is now.
Right now, just across the street from us,
And so that building was pre-Civil War. And a lot of listeners may not realize that. And there are a couple of photos that I have in the book that are from the University of Kentucky archives. And one of them shows 1944 with Joe Rosenberg's in that building. Okay. And then between 44 and 48, the building underwent some facade work. And all the old brickwork was covered up, and it was a tragic loss, so much so that when the several buildings on the block prior to demolition applied for listing on the National Register of Historic Places, it was deemed that this particular pre-Civil War building was a non-contributing structure.
Wow.
But that pre-Civil War building was where the Rite Aid was. So that Rite Aid, and a lot of listeners remember going into that Rite Aid. It was the drugstore downtown, other than Hutchinson's, another lost institution. But that building was very significant, though it was lost, at least visually, years before it was demolished.
Because they covered up all that brick.
Right.
Your book, Lost Lexington, was released in 2014. But in the last 5 years, we've gone through a lot of changes here in Lexington, and we've seen a lot of lost buildings and structures. Since your book was released, what other places have we lost?
So I think one of the biggest that we've lost is probably the People's Bank building on South Broadway. That blue turquoise with the zigzag roof line was just a neat example of mid-century architecture, modern architecture, that there are very few real strong examples of in Lexington. And there was a great effort to try and save that building with a lot of wonderful backers. But the cost of doing it, and there were some complications that really just made it a non-starter.
Yeah, I followed that campaign. It was sad to see that building go. It was such a, noticeable building because it was so different. It was just the juxtaposition of it between the two structures. Right. It was like a breath of fresh air. So it was a beautiful building. It was sad to see it go.
It was very sad to see that go. And, before People's Bank was there and before the apartments were to the left and the parking structure was to the right, all of that was residences from the 1800s.
Wow.
The evolution of Lexington is unchanging. So while we have this fight to preserve a mid-century structure, there was another argument before that as to whether this home should be lost. So it's interesting to just see, again, history repeating itself.
Exactly. And there's always that tug of war between, preservation and progress. So that takes us to the next question that I had for you. As a preservationist, you advocate a lot for preserving the integrity of buildings and the natural resources of Lexington. How do you reconcile holding on to the history of buildings to the necessary growth? Lexington is growing, our population is growing, and more people are moving here. How do we reconcile those two things?
I think reconciling those two competing values is important, and it's part of smart growth.
Yes.
There was the old bumper sticker campaign. Growth destroys the bluegrass forever.
Yeah.
Growth is good. Growth is necessary.
Yes.
And growth is good, but we can be smart about it. And if you think back to facade easements, to having H1 overlays in historic homes and historic properties, there are a lot of smart growth zoning rules and approaches that we can utilize that will allow Lexington to grow, but to maintain its beauty and what makes Lexington unique.
Do you have any examples of how smart growth was successful here in Lexington and how developers can contribute to that idea?
Well, I'm going to take a step before the developers and say one of the smartest things that we ever did in Lexington, and this is a tribute to the late Foster Pettit, and that was the original proposal for the interstate system was to go down 3rd Street. And if you can imagine how different Lexington would be if the interstate went down 3rd Street, cutting through those neighborhoods, those beautiful neighborhoods, as occurred in so many other cities across the country.
Yes.
And it would have really decimated the number of historical properties that we have, the neighborhoods, and it would have just been detrimental. So the effort was made by Mayor Pettit to urge the transportation department to relocate and to locate the interstate along the northern side of town.
Yeah.
And not affect and disrupt community.
Yeah, I think that's a smart idea too. Yeah. That is a beautiful neighborhood.
And that's multiple neighborhoods. You've got the historically African American East End. You've got the Transylvania campus area. I mean, you've got a number of different and varied communities that would have impacted.
And not to mention the traffic and
that.
Yeah.
On ramps and off ramps.
Yes. Yeah. Can you imagine? What are your thoughts on the new courthouse renovations?
It's gorgeous. Right. They've done a superb job. There's always critique that different people will have, and people are always, I've seen commentary that they wish that they could have full access to the dome at all times. And well,
because it's glassed in.
Because it's glassed in, and that's a fire code.
Yes, of course.
Number one, and number two, it's making the property economically viable.
Yeah.
And so when we're looking at how do we preserve and have smart growth, it's being able to preserve historic structures and do it in a way that's economically viable.
Yeah.
And I think, hopefully, fingers crossed, that's what they've done with the old courthouse.
Yeah. So while we're on the subject of the courthouse, what do you think about the statues that were removed from there in terms of a preservationist outlook. What are your thoughts on it?
I think the approach that they took was the right approach. The statues are not lost.
Yeah.
They have not been mothballed permanently. They were not torn down and destroyed.
Yeah.
Both of those individuals were part of a very tragic part of our history.
Of course.
And there's no disputing that. At least there should not be any disputing that. And I think that their home is in the cemetery. And I've been to both. And actually, I think the Hunt Morgan statue is much more accessible. There's the old story of Black Bess and how the Transy students and the UK students would paint Black Bess's genitalia pink.
Yeah.
When I last was at the cemetery, you could actually see some flecks of pink paint still. There's a part of Lost Lexington that is not necessarily lost yet. We still are able to see that a little bit better.
Yeah.
I think they did a great job with telling the story a little bit differently. And because those statues were going to be on the front lawn of not an active judicial center, but on the front lawn of our visitor center,
Yes.
that I think it was appropriate to have them relocated.
Of course, the argument is always going to remain, and we continue to have that conversation. But thank you for your contribution to that conversation. What projects are you working on now? Are you still researching and working on your blog?
So the blog has not had probably as many posts of late. I've had a few people reach out to me, when are you going to put more out? But I have been working on another book project. And
Awesome.
next year will be the 100th anniversary of the murder of Geneva Hardman, the trial of Will Lockett, and then the lynch mob that was rebuffed on the steps of the old courthouse.
During the brief trial of
The 35-minute trial.
the 35-minute trial.
Anyway, I'm working on a book that kind of chronicles that. And as I did with Lost Lexington, some of the backstories and some of the other untold characters that were involved in that. So little is known about young Geneva.
Yeah.
Winston Coleman's death at a courthouse. We really only learn a couple of lines about this young 10-year-old girl that was on her way to school. And, she was a daughter, a sister. Her family has an interesting story to tell.
Oh, we look forward to hearing it. Is it going to be a nonfiction, or are you going to take it down the fiction route?
It's nonfiction.
Okay, good. We look forward. We look forward to reading that book. We are so grateful that you took the time out to talk to us.
Mariam, it's been a pleasure.
We're going to link the blog on the podcast page. Of course, your book, Lost Lexington, is on sale now in hardback at Joseph Beth, or you can check it out from the library. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I'm going to have one more question for you. I want you to sign my copy,
absolutely.
if that's okay. All right. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Thanks for listening to Tales from the Kentucky Room, a podcast brought to you by the Central Library's Kentucky Room staff at the Lexington Public Library. If you enjoyed listening, please take a minute to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher. If you have any questions about local history or genealogy research, you can visit us in the Kentucky Room to use our collection and newspaper microfilm, or you can email us at elibrarian@lexpublib.org. That's elibrarian@lexpublib.org. I'm Mariam, and we'll be back with another trip down Lexington's memory lane.